it's really best not to think of yourself in that way as a kind of a savior or warrior, but rather try to focus on the person, this one particular individual, one at a time, who's sitting right in front of you, and you can do something.
Did you always want to do pro bono legal work? To be honest, I didn't have any such grandiose, noble, ambitions at the time when I was very much younger. Yeah. What attracted me to becoming a lawyer was the sense of fighting for injustices. We work with single mothers, migrant workers, local Singaporean citizens, all of whom have a common problem. They aren't able to afford to hire legal counsel for themselves. It cannot be a crime to be poor. Just because you're poor and you can't afford counsel, you shouldn't be handicapped when it comes to access to justice.
I suppose it doesn't help, with the news and TV programs that you have, that lawyers are first and foremost sharks and cost a lot of money. None of the lawyers, including myself, are resistant to pro bono work. In fact, actually, we look forward to pro bono cases to get in touch, or rather just go back to the core principles of why we practice law in the first place. I think the inspiration for pro bono work is actually a lot more personal for me. My father has been doing volunteer work for 30 years. I take inspiration from that, that selflessness in wanting to do good.
I had a law degree, but I wasn't intensely attracted to being a lawyer. Sometimes it may not be all that rewarding. So I started volunteering at home in March of 2016. When I actually got thrown into the deep end of doing the work and seeing the cases that came into our help desk, and I realized that it's something that I can't unsee. I feel very privileged that now I'm able to do it full time, and that I'm able to do it as home staff.
Do you fight for clients you don't believe in? Now, it's a difficult question sometimes because there are tensions involved. So one of the cases that keeps coming to mind is a case where I had to defend a person alleged of rape who was accused of raping an underage girl. I had some difficulties in believing him on a personal basis because of his explanations, but there was no evidence to support the act of rape or sexual assault. Even my wife was looking at me and saying, you have a young daughter yourself, how could you act for somebody like this? And you had to then sit and explain to say, listen, under the Constitution, everyone is entitled to representation, everyone is entitled to a fair defense, and we need to carry out our duties, to the best of our abilities. It is not my role or function as an advocate to determine the guilt or innocence of my client.
I think there's a distinction between believing someone and believing in that person. I may feel that someone is not telling me the whole truth, but it's our responsibility to try to learn to see things through their eyes. There are very understandable circumstances that drive people to do this out of necessity. Because when you have a case, illegal working means working for someone other than their work permit employer, which is not allowed, and you're on a no work, no pay basis, then what do? You still have to eat, you still have to have a roof over your head, and you were the sole breadwinner of your family, then what could you do? If I can't bring myself to empathize with someone or to find something to believe in that person, then I would consider that a failure on my part. We have to, stay in their corner because often no one else will.
What is one case I will never forget? A foreign worker had worked for a construction company, and he had worked a lot of hours of overtime and was in charge of 2 or 3 other workers. Because of that, the employer then tried to argue that he was more like a manager or an executive. Now, under employment law in Singapore at the time, an executive or a manager actually isn't entitled to claim overtime. And so we appealed the matter to the High Court, and he recovered the overtime that he deserved. But I think the bigger effect was that there was a lot more discussion and a lot more awareness of the practice of mislabeling workers. In fact, actually a year after that, the Employment Act was actually changed, not just obviously for foreign workers, but for all workers in general, especially PMETs.
So there was a day, I think in 2016, 2017, suddenly there was this lady kneeling on the floor in front of the reception counter, and I went up to her to ask her what it was. She immediately grabbed my legs and started talking to me in Mandarin about, oh, please help me, please help me. And I realized that this was the lady that, you know, we had turned down because she kept repeatedly shoplifting. Now, initially we thought that she was suffering perhaps from kleptomania or some kind of disorder. However, the medical report showed that that was not the case. If she didn't, buck up and do something herself to self-control her impulses, we would not grant assistance. And we couldn't, as difficult as it was.
One example that I would say was a worker whose case where the High Court judgment was actually reported in the Singapore Law Reports, injured his knee quite badly when he fell off a ladder. His company did not report the workplace injury to MOM, so eventually he reported it to MOM. That was some 8 months later in January 2014, by which time, after 8 months, he couldn't remember the precise date that the accident occurred. So he gave a kind of range. But of course, for the purposes of insurance, you need to pin down a date. To cut a long story short, eventually he was charged with making a fraudulent claim. In his mind, he was thinking that, yes, it was my mistake. I didn't give the precisely correct date to the MOM when I reported my workplace injury. What he did not intend to do was to say, yes, I'm a fraud, I'm a cheat. I wanted to cheat the insurance system. And he felt that he had to retract his guilty plea. He wants to say that, you can convict me, but you're not going to hear it from my own mouth that I'm a cheat. I was really humbled by it. The day after that, he actually started his sentence. He went to jail. But, the High Court eventually was with us. We were able to get back some of the compensation that he should have gotten in the first place, and we sent it to him. For Rafiqul's case, I think what I learned or what I took away from it was that our work is not about the result for our clients. It's to accompany them through that and to help them to get back that sense that I can make my choices, even if it has no practical benefit.
Okay, so here it is. A modest little card holder, and it was the first pro bono case that I did. Someone had forged the resident's signature on a bail bond document. We managed to convince the court that indeed that he was not capable of signing that document. So when the case was over, I didn't really see him again. But surprisingly, at the end of the year, he actually came to my office together with a caseworker from the shelter, and he actually gave me a present. That really reminded me that it's the little things that we do to help others that is really meaningful, and just strengthened my resolve to do more pro bono work.
How often do you win? Honestly, never. Because for a migrant worker who has gone through this extremely arduous and very, very protracted process, we can't really, at the end of it, even if we win, we can't really say, oh, wow, we are the champions. Pati Liani's case was definitely a very fairy tale ending, to be sure. Of course, it is not really justice until she, until there is some kind of recompense for what she has gone through.
The worker wins, but what he wins or what he gets is a judgment, which is a piece of paper. But when he tries to enforce that against the employer, he's unable to do so either because the employer has gone bust or the employer has no money. So it's very much an empty victory for the worker, and those are to some extent the most unfortunate and the saddest cases of all.
Very often before we can get to that stage, the worker is already like, I can't take it anymore, and I can't just continue sitting around here like fighting for my innocence, which can't feed my family. So very often, we don't even get to that stage where we can prove ourselves or prove the case for our client.
In situations where the applicant could be the sole breadwinner of the family and are facing a long period of incarceration, we want to ensure that the family doesn't lose the support as well. So we work with a lot of our collaborators to see them through while the case is going through court and even after the case is resolved. So that too could be a win for me, because the last thing you want is for the children from this family to suffer because the sole breadwinner of the family is gone. Have you ever thought of giving up dealing with pro bono work? I have never ever given that idea, especially in my present role now. Pro bono work will always be important to me. It's good for the karma, it's good for the soul. It generally keeps you grounded as well, because you're giving back to society, to those who need it most.
Not really, it never really crossed my mind to give up the work as a whole, although of course there can be individual cases where we feel like we reached the end of the road. One example that comes to mind is a worker who was accused of molesting someone. The prosecution insisted that, this is the evidence, we have statements from witnesses. The lawyer's advice was, why don't you just accept what the prosecution is offering? It's a 2-week sentence. I also spent a number of times talking to the worker and telling him, I know how much you wish to go back to your family. Your wife just gave birth. Your family needs you. You've been suffering so much here. If you take the prosecution's offer, you have like a week or even less of time in jail under sentence, no caning, and then you can just put all of this behind you and go back home. And he was like, no, I have to fight because I never did such a thing. I would never do that. And what happened at the end was that the prosecution dropped the charges on the first day that the trial was supposed to take place. I do regret how during that case, why was I that pushy with him? Like, why didn't I just say, sure, we'll fight with you all the way?
I wanted to say not yet, but I think the better answer is no. Pro bono work is, I believe, part and parcel of what I do, and it's something that I enjoy doing. Law is a calling, I believe, but at the same time, the practical truth is that a lot of practice of law is also a bit of a business. If lawyers only do pro bono work when they have the time, then they wouldn't do pro bono work, because most lawyers will tell you they have no time. So it really must come from a willingness, personal willingness, in fact, to want to do pro bono work, in spite of whatever you have on your plate.
Do you see yourself as a social justice defender? Well, for me, a social justice defender is somebody who ensures access to justice, right? Regardless of your position in society, you should have access to counsel, you should have access to justice, you should be made aware of your legal rights. If that is what you think a social justice defender is, then yes, I would see myself as a social justice defender.
No. So we can have some legal successes in court from time to time, and we have a lot of kind-hearted people who are doing a lot of charity. But social justice, I think as a society, we've barely even begun to think about what social justice for migrant workers should be. The business environment that they work in is structured in such a way to treat them as disposable, just use and discard. They're really entirely disposable. You can terminate them at will. So it's really best not to think of yourself in that way as a kind of a savior or warrior, but rather try to focus on the person, one particular individual, one at a time, who's sitting right in front of you, and you can do something.
It's always easy to give money to a cause, but if you don't have a lawyer who's willing to take on that work, then unfortunately the litigant, the pro bono litigant, is still going to be unrepresented. I think there's nothing more satisfying than to be able not just to help somebody, but to use a skill set that you have that not many people have to help someone in a specific way. I think that's not just gratifying personally, but just vindicates the amount of time and effort we've spent into training to be lawyers and being lawyers as well.
Hey guys, we hope this episode has been enlightening for you. Every year, the Law Society Pro Bono Services runs different programs to offer legal representation to anyone who might need it, regardless of race, social status, or nationality. Click on the links in our comments below to find out the different ways you can help someone in legal difficulty. If you enjoy our series, you can watch more Can Ask Me episodes on our playlist over here. Click on the bell icon to be notified of our latest released episodes.